there was the story from a man who I did interview, who lived in Fort Wayne, who was an educator, and he again was very patient with me when I was asking questions. He's in my first book. His name is John Worley, and he was explaining what it was like to be there. And because of all the details he could give me, I decided to open the book with what it was like for him to become separated from his unit in all of the chaos when the Germans, the Battle of the Bulge, the name the Bulge comes because the Germans invaded on December 16th, 1944. They drove themselves between some American units and British units and tried to minimize their effectiveness by separating them and causing a bulge. And that's where the name comes from. So at some point, John Worley became separated. And so it was, and he was out in this, it was wintry weather, but at that point on December 16th, there was not a lot of snow yet, but that would change over the next month. But he was alone and, very, very, very scared. So he definitely, absolutely could have been killed, possibly just had his body lay there then too. I've talked to several people whose family members were killed there, and that makes it very real. I just met a lady this summer whose father was killed. She never knew him. She was 2 or 3, and her mother never remarried. So that was, that makes it a big heart tug there. And so that's, again, why I did this, because this was Winston Churchill, even. He was the Prime Minister of England at the time. He believed that this was the biggest battle of the whole war. So it was quite an achievement if he survived.
Wow. And that's something, you hear the term Battle of the Bulge, but I never knew anything about it, So I'm so glad that you can kind of go into some detail there and share those experiences. And 260 veterans you've talked to, and I'm sure all of their stories are so important and very memorable. But do you have anything that has kind of stood out from there of stories that you've done in the time that you've gotten to interview all these people?
Sure. I believe that the stories in my POW book, I call it POW book, but the name is Captured: Stories of American World War II Prisoners of War. These, I feel like every American should read this book to gain a huge appreciation for what these very young men went through. And I have to say young, I don't even want to call them men because most of them were in their teens. In fact, this young guy right here, I would call him a boy. He was only 15 years old when he ran away from home and joined the Army. He was 16 years old when he was captured in the Philippines at the Battle of Bataan. He was part of the Bataan Death March. He did escape, but then he was recaptured. So from age 16 through age 19, at the end of the war, he was a slave laborer for the Japanese. He served first in the Philippines, and then he was taken to Japan to serve in the coal yards. If you've read the book or seen the movie Unbroken with Louis Zamperini, that shows at the very end of the movie, it shows him being in one of those coal yards in Japan. So it's possible that these two could have known each other. And it was really difficult. But his daughter actually lives near me, and she had his memoirs that he wrote after the war. And so basically it's word for word in the book because he was a high school dropout, you could say, but actually he wrote very well. And so all I did was just clean up the grammar a little bit, but his stories of running through the jungle and struggling to find food and just always having to watch the skies for the Japanese planes and being separated from the Allied troops. Very scary for that young man. But of course, all of them, there's 8 stories in the book, and 5 of them are Allied aircrew members who were shot down. And then there's 2 that were the Army, and then 1 that was the Navy. So it was, more than one branch. We don't want to assume it's always just a POW is Army, aircrew, Air Force, or just Navy was also in the Pacific. So there's 2 stories in here from the Pacific. The rest were in German camps in Europe. So those stories, I believe, are very tough to read. I actually had put off writing this book because I just knew, oh man, reading about things, and these were real people. These aren't fiction. This is real. But last year, I thought, you know what? We all feel like POWs. We were told we couldn't go places. We couldn't buy certain things. People were getting sick. There was a lot of confusion. And I thought, if there's ever any year that people might be willing to read a book about POWs and get a perspective, that's the whole thing. Compared to what they went through, we didn't go through anything. I mean, we still had, basically, we had our freedoms. And we had a very difficult year. I would never minimize that. I didn't get to see my mother in her nursing home for 9 months. So that was really hard. But again, compared to what they went through, it does help me think, oh, some people still have things so much harder. And that helps. That helps to get through things.
Yes.
So, those are the stories I feel like are pretty much the ones that might help our country just to get a grasp on what we're going through.
Right. It is so hard for us to understand that, for sure.
It is. It's tough. And yet I'm so glad I wrote it. And I do give talks on this topic, by the way. That's one of my most popular requests, is the POW book. So that was, again, if I can impress on people how much freedom means and has meant to our veterans over the years, and what the flag means, and I see it on your shirt there, that's worth it to me, to be able to say these men, they went through very difficult situations, but they continued to fly their flag through the rest of their life outside their house.
Yeah. And we were visiting a little bit before we started recording, and that you mentioned something that I think is very important, is these people aren't perfect. These
right.
soldiers, these veterans, but we're doing the best that they could at the time. And
yeah. And they were really young. I mean, those men in the Army, Air Force, I mean, that was a big deal, flying those big bombers when they were like maybe 18, 19, 20 years old. If you were 24, 25, you were called the old man. And here they are, flying over enemy territory and getting shot at. It's just outstanding to me. And I know people have called them the greatest generation. And I don't know that I feel comfortable saying that, because I have also interviewed men from the Korean War and Vietnam, and even post 9/11. I've interviewed those men and women, but there's just something kind of special about World War II. I have to say, because it really was a world war. There was like 70 plus countries that were involved. I mean, South America. I didn't know South America was that involved until I started studying. Yeah. So it's pretty much my passion at this point.
Yeah, and it is, you just don't understand the complexity and all the fingers and things that were in World War II, and, all the different areas that contributed to the war effort. It's So I thank you for
Oh,
not taking a stab at, but helping people to understand, part of the war effort and the situation that people were in. Now, you kind of briefly mentioned this, but out of the 260 people you interviewed, 20 of them were women.
yes,
So could you
yes.
kind of talk about that?
I would happily talk about my gals. And my word for them is plucky. Because when I give a talk about them, I say those plucky women of World War II. And in fact, I put together a coloring book about them. And if I can, I'll just show a few pictures here.
Please.
This is a WASP. Her name was Margaret Ringenberg. WASP is women's, I've just forgotten, women's accept.
I actually, I
Air
do know
service
that.
pilots.
Yes.
Women's air service pilots. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember. And then this gal in the back was in the Army. And these are all women that I've interviewed. Some of them stayed here in the United States, but there were 3 who were nurses who served in Europe. And that is a big deal because women were not accepted by everyone in the military to be in the military. They were told they shouldn't be wearing pants and they shouldn't be wearing a uniform. It was a man's war. And you know who some of the worst critics were? Their mothers. And I've heard this from almost every one of them. Almost everyone said that their mothers were afraid that no man would want to marry them afterwards because they had been in the military. And you know who they almost all married? Soldiers. I just think that is so, I might even have felt that way. Who knows? But, it was a culture thing. Women still weren't wearing pants. And this was the first time that the military had certain branches for the women, that the Women's Army Corps, that was new. The Navy, the Waves, that was new. The WASP, that was the first time women had served in planes, I think. Yes, World War II, yes. So they were breaking new ground. It was amazing to talk with them. And I should mention too, I do have women in all 4 of my World War II Legacies series. I have 4 books, and I do have at least a couple women in each book. I don't have nearly as many women as men, but I tried to put them at least a couple in each. And I want to mention this lady right here, Lucille Clark. She gave me the privilege of taking her on an honor flight. Have you heard of honor flights?
I have, yes.
Oh, okay. It was an honor flight of Northeast Indiana. And I bet your friend from Fort Wayne knows about it because it's a very highly respected group in this area. She was 95 when I took her, and she was a Navy ensign, I think was her rank. And she had been a secretary, and she is still living. She just turned 100. And I visited her this summer. And so it's a very bonding experience. So my husband has also taken a vet. And then I also took a male vet who was in the Army. So that was very fun. So that's what I do with my women. I try to make what they did as sacrificial as possible. And every story is different, I tell people, even if everybody had been in the Army, their stories would still be very, very singular and distinctive. But one thing I do try to do, and you've alluded to it too, I just try to write for the non-military reader because I'm not a military person, and I want to make sure people can understand what these people went through by not putting a bunch of jargon. But, I do like the terminology too, and finding out what some of their distinctive words were. Some of them can't be repeated, but it's very cool to me to hear how the culture was at that point evolving.
Yeah, I just get goosebumps when you talk about being around them, because there's just something about being around somebody who's made that sacrifice, you know, and we still have those people around today, from other wars and
Yes.
being in the military in general. So yeah. So one thing I was going to ask you, and you kind of said you have done Zoom interviews with and Skype, but you have gotten to go, you know, in person to do some of these interviews?
Oh, yes. When I did pre-COVID, again, to say that, don't we? I did as many in-person interviews as possible. I wanted to be in front of them because I wanted them to be able to hear me, first of all. I don't think I've ever done a phone interview because their hearing is so bad. And a lot of times that was due to the military, by the way. I wanted to be in front of them and see their faces as they talked about something that maybe was difficult for them. And by the way, if anybody ever told me, no, I don't want to do an interview, that was the end. I did not ever harass anybody. And if after 70 years, if it was still difficult for them to talk about, that is fine. I would always tell them, well, thank you for your service. I'm doing this to help preserve our military history for the next generations. And that may or may not have swayed them. But anyway, so I did get told no sometimes, but I wanted to do it in front of them and in their own place where they're comfortable, sitting in their own chair, where they can reach whatever they need, if they need a Kleenex or if they need to use the restroom, whatever is most comfortable for them. I tried to respect them in that way. And, you know, even if they had downsized to one room and then maybe a bedroom, pretty much their World War II stuff went with them. They would still have a picture of them in uniform on the wall and or a photograph album. Boy, when I would run into men or women who had a lot of mementos left, and I thought, oh, thank you, God, hallelujah. And I would just get my scanner out and start scanning, because that can lead to so many details in the writing, confirmation of them. If I have their discharge papers, I can make sure that the dates they've given me are correct. And of course, photos. I've used as many photos as I could that were clear enough. And I really love making the books authentic with those things that are special.